address, phone number. I checked the box and said I'd help knock on doors, that I'd vote for Barack, help make phone calls. And then I had the opportunity to go out to Iowa for 3 days before their caucus. Iowa was the first state to start off the primary season. And I went out to Iowa, and what I thought it was going to be was just, 3 days of phone banking, knocking on doors, doing some college outreach. And I was not expecting to see what we saw there. So we got to Iowa and realized that the majority of people who were volunteering for Barack's campaign were precisely the people that CNN said would never turn up. They were under 35 or under 30 years old. A lot of them had taken, not that I'm suggesting you do this, but I'm sure we'd love to have your support, taking time off of school to volunteer for the campaign, or folks who were working 2 or 3 jobs who hadn't been able to afford college, who were coming in for an hour or 2 a week just to help phone bank or register people to vote. And I wasn't expecting to see that. And so meeting all these folks, they convinced me to stay longer than the 3 days, and I ended up moving to Iowa for a month and a half leading up to the election. And the disclaimer that I have to give you, otherwise I sound disingenuous, is that there was a writer's strike going on in California. So I had no job. I was unemployed. The TV show House had shut down. So it wasn't such a bad thing to do. But because of this writer's strike, there were, interestingly, contradictory articles that were being written in the paper and contradictory stories that were being run on CNN. The first was that, did you know that the average age of caucusing in Iowa in 2004 was 65? So the implication there is that we have no shot in actually increasing youth vote numbers, that we're too passive to get out there and vote. They kept running these stories. Will they actually vote, with a big question mark? And then they would interview, college students who said, no, I don't care, or no, it's not going to make a difference. At the same time, these same media outlets were running articles that had to do with this writer's strike and new media. So MySpace, Facebook, and YouTube were statistics they kept using. And they didn't see any correlation between these two stories, or these two sets of stories at all. How many of you have seen at least one video on YouTube in the last 3 days? Same here. Good shape, John. So YouTube is a free service to use. We use it regularly. YouTube makes $7.5 million a month in advertising revenue, just from how many of us actually log on and regularly watch videos. MySpace was started not too long ago, and they recently sold for just under $600 million to a company called News Corp, one of the world's largest media conglomerates. Not such a bad deal for the people that started MySpace. Facebook was the most clear contradictory example of what we saw. Facebook, which I will have to add the mayor on. That was awesome, by the way. So Facebook was started by 3 college guys in their 20s, just a couple of years ago. These 3 guys are still in their 20s. And Facebook was recently valued at $1.6 billion. So we sat there and we said, hold on a second. You're telling us that the average age of caucusing was 65, that we're not actually going to be able to make a difference because we don't care and we don't have numbers to show for it. At the same time, you're telling us that we made billions of dollars in wealth for our peers' companies just by sitting in front of our computers and tagging photos and messaging your friends and then waking up the next morning and quickly untagging the photos that you made. And that's it. No oil wars for our generation, no conflict diamond mining, none of this. It was just internet wealth that we made just by sitting there. And if we could create billions of dollars in wealth for our peers by sitting in front of our computers, then think about the power that we have to change the face of a presidential election. And not just one presidential election, but really the way in which politics operate in this country to begin with. And so you saw a huge groundswell of effort in Iowa on college campuses with high school groups and community groups that were mobilized by folks under the age of 30 or under the age of 25. And there were discussions that were being had from folks who had voted lifelong Republicans, who were independents like myself, or lifelong Democrats, coming together because they finally realized that here was a man who everyone had said would never get his campaign off the ground because he was 30 points behind in the polls in Iowa. They said that he would never get his campaign off the ground because he rejected federal lobbyist money and he rejected special interest money. And that there's no way that you can run a successful campaign without their money. And Barack's belief was that small donations and actually challenging us to do our part would make a difference. And so we kept mobilizing, we kept saying, we reject the notion, this archaic notion of the Washington elite that says that we need oil lobbyists' money in order to run a presidential campaign. And Barack himself said, the only people I want to owe favors to are the American people. I don't want to owe favors to pharmaceutical companies, because then you can't make healthcare more affordable. And so what you saw was a pretty incredible shift. And that led up to the top two news stories the day after the Iowa election. The first was that Barack Obama won the Iowa caucus. The second was that the youth vote was critical in making that happen. And the youth vote in Iowa, they said, increased from 2004 to this past January by 150%. And that's a trend that we saw continue. I was in Minnesota on February 5th for the caucus. There were lines that we saw on college campuses. You know, if the caucus location was on the 4th or 5th floor, the lines were going all the way down and out into the freezing cold. Regularly on college campuses. So this trend wasn't just Iowa, it's something that continued in every primary state after that. I think it culminated in Florida, where they had a 300% increase in the youth vote between 2000 and this past primary season. So that's what you saw. And the story that I like to tell that signifies exactly how that all came together was told to us by a guy who walked into Barack's office 3 days before that Iowa election. His name was Gary Lamb. Gary Lamb walks into the office at 10 o'clock at night. We were all making phone calls. There were about 100 of us, 150 of us. He's this tall, with a cowboy hat and cowboy boots on. And he walks in, and he introduces himself, 70 years old. My name is Gary Lamb. I'm the former head of the Iowa Farmers Union. And he said, put down your phones and look up from your computers for 2 minutes, because there's something that I want you to know. And so we did. And he said, I want you to know that as long as I can remember, politicians have come to the state of Iowa every 4 years, because Iowa is the first to have their caucus, the first to kick off the primary season. And every 4 years, he said, these politicians come, and the politicians make promises to college students, the politicians make promises to family farmers, the politicians make promises to church groups and environmentalists. And then the election takes place, and the politicians leave. And another 4 years go by, and a new set of politicians come to the state. He said, before you go back to work tonight, I just want you to very simply go look up the definition of the word politician. And then look up the definition of the word statesman. Because this is the first time in my life, he said, that I've had the chance to know a true statesman. And he very quietly turned around and left the room. And we looked up those two definitions. And I like telling that story because I would love for you to do the same thing. Whether you voted before, or if this is your first election, whether you've considered yourself a Republican or a Democrat or an independent like myself, we looked up those two definitions and then looked around the room. And for the first time actually blatantly noticed that there were folks from every single quote-unquote demographic group that had remained divided before. There were folks from a group called pro-life Democrats that were working for Obama's campaign. There were veterans, LGBT folks, folks from every imaginable ethnic background you could think of, working towards this common goal because we finally realized that we could be mobilized for something much, much greater than ourselves. And the reason that you see folks telling a lot of these stories, and the reason you see such a huge college outreach effort, I don't want to get these numbers wrong, so I wrote it down. In 2004, this state was decided by a popular vote margin of 98,319 votes. That's what Kerry won by, 98,319 votes. There are more than 362,000 college students in the state of Minnesota. So if you actually register to vote, if you actually sign up on the clipboard back there and pledge to volunteer at least an hour of your time between now and November, it'll make a huge, significant difference that nobody can. And people have done it in the past. This has been the momentum that's been created. But the big discussion that we've been having as of late is, do you realize that if the people in positions of power who have been part of these lobbying ties with the senators for decades, no matter what their party affiliation, do you realize that if they wanted everyone to have a fair shot at voting, then Election Day would have been a national holiday? And it's not. And one of the truly rare luxuries of being a college student are that in the, 60 days leading up to the election, you can do simple things like babysitting someone's kid while they go vote, or driving them to the polls, or making phone calls for an hour because of how much it actually makes a huge difference. And I would love to see you do it to continue to prove cynics wrong, and it'd be amazing to have another positive CNN story about how our generation's not lazy in